17-year-old Nodirbek Abdusattorov shocked the world recently when he won the World Rapid Championship, and for this incredible feat, he received from the President of Uzbekistan a huge cash prize, a 2-bed apartment, and also a presidential medal. So an incredible achievement for the youngster, and to get there, winning the tournament, he had to beat Magnus Carlsen, and this was the most critical game that he played in the tournament for me, other than the tiebreak game, which you can also see on this channel. I'll link on screen now. So this game was the 4th round before the end, and Abdusattorov had white here, Magnus with black, and we see this English on the board. And this was really a big swing, because if he could win this, not only would he gain the points, which he did, but then he'd also peg Magnus back. So we had this English on board here, and now Abdusattorov goes for this unusual e4 move, bit of a sideline. Magnus goes bishop b4, which is also what Nepo played in the tie breaks. And now we had pawn to d3. Just a quick note, you don't want to go bishop to c5 here as black, because then actually white has this tactic of taking on e5, and after takes d4, white is doing well here. And I mention this because after bishop b4, d3, protecting this pawn, d6, a3, bishop c5, you might wonder, well, why has black wasted this tempo? And that's the reason why. You can't go to c5 immediately, but you want to get it outside of the pawn chain, and you also kind of force d3 to protect e4. Now we had pawn to b4, immediately gaining queenside space. The bishop dropped back, and knight a4 now seeks to pick up the bishop pair, but you are losing time here as white. So that's what now happens. We had bishop to g4, the bishop pair got picked up, and the pawn recaptured here. And Magnus is doing fairly well out of the opening because he's got lots of pieces developed. And this bishop move is designed to eliminate this knight to gain more control over this weakened d4 square. Now we had bishop to b2 developing, covering that square, and black takes immediately on f3 here, just not waiting for h3, wanting to chop that knight off the board, and arguably then misplace the queen, because now Magnus wants to head for this position, which is very Magnus-esque. So he goes knight d7, we had pawn to g3 developing, and queen to f6. So you don't really want to take here as white, because one, Magnus just loves these kind of endgame squeezes, and two, although you've got the bishop pair as white, these knights are generally going to outperform the bishops in these more closed pawn structures. Knights tend to do better. So instead we had queen to d1, good move, and now we had knight to f8 from Magnus, a really nice remaneuver looking at this d4 square, bishop to g2 development, knight to e6, and now there was a shot here which actually white could have played. You're not necessarily going to see this in rapid, but f4 is a really nice break here. You want to at some point play f4 or d4, but that's clearly kind of impossible right now, because then it liberates your position. And the idea here is that you're taking advantage of this pin against the queen. But okay, this was missed by white. Instead castles, and now Magnus gets g5, clamping that move. And now a really nice move from white. It might look strange to a beginner player to play bishop h3 here, because this is one of your prized pieces often in these structures, keeping that light squared bishop. But when you understand more about positional chess, we realise that that white bishop is actually a bad bishop because it's sitting on the same colour complex as its own pawns in the centre. So it's a good move to actually play like this, and after h5, eliminate that knight, get rid of your bad bishop, and also take away an attacker of this key d4 square. So the queen recaptures, logical, stepping out of all of these pins here. And now we had pawn to b5, kicking that knight. You don't want to jump into d4 here, because now f4 has extra venom to it, because you could have a line which goes something like this, where instead of recapturing the pawn, white takes the knight. Pawn recaptures, rook takes here. This is nice for white. So coming back here, Magnus correctly dropped that knight back. And now we had pawn to f4, a really important break. You either want to do that or d4, but you need to get some play going. Magnus now captures the pawn. You could even take with the rook here. It is an option because of this pin down here. but the pawn recaptures, still a good move. Knight to d7, redeploying that knight, and king to h1 now, stepping off the open g-file. One quick thing to note is that if you close the position with f5, the queen sits quite nicely on f6 here, and the knight's coming to c5, you're going to get castled as black, bring rooks to the g-file. It's a bit unpleasant for white. So king h1 is correct. Now we had queen to g4. You don't want to change these queens because after captures, you can't actually win this pawn with, say, rook to g1 because rook h4 comes just in time, and it's quite a nice bind for black. Once again, the superior knight over bishop is a big factor in this position. So instead we had the queen coming into f3, keeping an eye on this pawn. Now we had pawn to f6 from Magnus, and queen e3 now from Abdusattorov. A nice sidestep, and he's basically preparing to bring a rook to the g-file, so he had to first move the queen. Now we had castles from Magnus, and now pawn to f5. Again, just to sort out that pawn problem so there's no capture. Now you're ready to bring your rook to the g-file. Pawn to h4 from Magnus gives the queen a square. Rook to g1, queen to h5, and now rook to g6. A nice invasion here by white. But after rook d to g8, black is actually doing fine. And again, it's because you just can't get this bishop into the game. So we had the other rook coming to the g-file now. Magnus correctly takes, and now best for white is actually taking with the rook. For the reason being that when you take with the pawn, which is what was done in the game, this pawn actually now becomes weak. But here Magnus goes wrong. So he first plays rook to g8, which is good, but after pawn to g7, now he had to sort out the problems along this diagonal with queen h3 coming. So he should have gone knight to c5 immediately so that that knight isn't pinned to the queen. And now it's tricky for white because it's hard to activate the queen when this pawn is now attacked. Plus there's a lot of threats from the black queen coming in on these light squares. So after queen h3 in this line, king to b8, now it's much more difficult for white to find good moves. But if we run back here to the game continuation, Magnus goes actually queen h7 first, a bit too hasty to pick up this pawn, because now after queen h3, you've got some problems liberating this knight. You don't really want to play king d8, it's a bit ugly. So instead Magnus goes rook takes on g7, rook recaptures, queen takes, and the queen wins this pawn. That's one of the critical differences in this variation, and this queen is no longer so active as we saw before, nor is the knight. So the knight now comes into c5, and the bishop comes to c1, looking to redeploy. And one of the challenges for black now is that white has this really dangerous outside passed pawn. And now Magnus plays pawn to c6, good move. I should say that you don't want to take on d3 here, or now we have the move queen h3 check. Hitting this one, hitting the knight, you're losing a piece. So that's why we had pawn to c6 instead from Magnus. And now Abdusattorov takes this pawn. You don't really want to allow black to take here because after the recapture, that pawn could become a bit vulnerable later on, say with a queen d7 at the right moment, and it's hard to push a4 when the knight is covering that square. So we had captures here, pawn recaptures, queen h3 check, king to b7, queen to f3 now, keeping an eye on this one, queen h7 from Magnus, and he's now eyeing these light squares really menacingly, so you wouldn't want to take on f6 for example as black, because now you have this knight takes on d3 move, and things are really starting to collapse for white. So white correctly doesn't go in for this. After queen h7, bishop d2 was played, good move, improving that piece. King to a6 from Magnus, king to g2, queen to g7 check, king to f1. And both players are playing this stage of the game really accurately. So queen h7 now, pawn to h3, and pawn to d5 from Magnus. And now he makes a break in the centre. And it's really quite complicated here, and I don't want to go through every single variation. There are multiple moves to keep the balance. But white goes queen f5, which is a good move. Magnus goes queen g8, also good. And now we have the exchange of pawns in the centre here and a second capture on d5. So it brings Magnus's queen in and activates it, but king e2 just holds this pawn in time. Now we had king to b5, further bringing the king into the position. You want to get that king active in endgames. And bishop to e3 from Abdusattorov, looking in this direction, further improvement of the piece. Whoops. And now queen to g2 check, so the checks begin. This was maybe slightly inaccurate actually, because after bishop f2, king to a4, pawn to h4, white now just has this creeping dangerous threat of this h-pawn going down the board. It's just a bit faster than black's own passed pawn here on the queen side. Now we had pawn to e4 from Magnus, so he's desperately trying to seek counterplay and shake it up. We had a captures here, and the knight came in very menacingly now, looking around the king, but queen f3 is a really calm move. And the problem for Magnus now is you can't ever swap the queens, because after the king recaptures, this pawn is just way too fast in this position. The king is also supporting it, and the bishop outperforms knights in such endgames where you're playing on both sides of the board. So instead of this, Magnus goes queen to g6, and now pawn h5 and queen e8. Bishop e3 comes in the way of that discovered check. Pawn to f5 now, bolstering the knight. And if you want to pause and see why you shouldn't take this pawn as white, then please do so. And if you're enjoying the video, do smash that subscribe button to never miss another. So if you take the pawn here, we've got a nice little nice fork. That's end of game. So instead of taking the pawn, we had h6. Let's keep going. Passed pawns needs to be pushed. Queen e5 now. King to f1. Queen to d5. And it's a long game this one, so I'm moving through the moves here. King g2, queen g8 check, king h3, and knight g5 check. And this wasn't such a great move from Magnus, because although you get these pieces off the board, actually after the captures, now black's in some trouble. So we had queen c6 check, the king takes on a3, and now there was a draw there if Nodirbek wanted it. He is a pawn down, remember, but no, he pushed for more. Outstanding fighting spirit from the youngster. So he throws in these few checks, but then he plays queen g7, and you can't swap these queens. This one's going through. He recognises the danger of that passed pawn. So Magnus now drops the queen away, king to h4, pawn to f4, queen to d7 check, b5, pawn h7, queen e5, covering that queening square. And now we had king to g4, coming next to this one to take at the right moment. And here Magnus actually chucks that pawn. So the reason he does this is that after pawn f3 captures, he's trying to actually allow himself to check the king more freely. I mean, not from this square, but just generally speaking, he doesn't want that pawn to be a shield to his own checks. So now the checks begin, and there's this big run around the board. The king actually comes all the way over to the queen side. Magnus keeps checking, and the queen interposes in a moment. And remember, you can never trade the queens, or this one's just going instantly through. So a few more checks here. The queen blocks, the king keeps running around. And once we get to this position here, Magnus doesn't actually have any more checks. So he comes in front of this pawn, and now we have some checks from white, running this black king down the board, and the king marches in here. Now this was Magnus's last chance. He could have actually checked from c8, and who knows what would have happened. According to the computer, best play, you can make a draw here at 0-0-0 if you keep checking the king around, but it's so difficult in rapid when your opponent is just one square away, because one misstep and the queens come off and you're done. And that's what actually happened in this game. So after pawn to b4, sorry, I should say Magnus played pawn b4 instead of queen c8 check. We then had this series of moves. Check here, the king came down, and now this game's actually lost. So these are on the same rank, diagonal, sorry, and this is the big problem. So queen d4 check, and here Magnus resigned. The game's completely gone. Take, pawn's going through. And just to quickly show you this, to go to checkmate, black goes b3, queen here, b2, but now you can actually just force checkmate. So queen a8 here, moves the king across. Let's go right to the end, something like this. That's checkmate. Amazing game by the youngster. If you want to see the tie break he played against Nepo, then do click here, and to subscribe to the channel, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.